Well, ladies and gentlemen, about 2 years ago, a work called In Strange Woods came out, and I think about it often. I still do. It is a emotional powerhouse. The characters are alive. You don't forget them. The story is compelling. And for me, one of the great tests of a great work of art is the rewatching or the re-listening or the reread. The first time you don't know what's going to happen and you're kind of pulled along by the plot and so on and so forth, and that's really good. But the real powerful test is when you revisit something. And is it alive in new ways? Do you encounter the characters in manners that still move you emotionally? This is a very hard accomplishment. This is not easy. And In Strange Woods has done it now after 3 visits. The first year it came out, a year later, and then this year, which I had this lovely weekend to revisit it. It is like I'm listening to it for the first time, and ideas I didn't have the first time arose. Lines of dialogue, all of these things really made it feel like the work is still alive, because it is still alive, because Mr. Brett Ryback and Jeff Luppino-Esposito have contributed and made a work of genius, along with all the actors. The divine Matt Sav on the music, I love that man, have all created this wonderful work. And I have the honor and privilege of speaking to Brett and Jeff today. Gentlemen, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having us. It's really exciting.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. Always love your insights on our work. You've been so generous about it the whole time since we first released it. And you're one of those readers, I'll use the word readers here, but listeners, who illuminates things that often we weren't even thinking about, or it brings to light things that we had thought about and are just so excited to hear someone receive. So I love talking to you about it.
Well, Jeff, that's very kind, Brett. I really appreciate it. One of the other tests, if you will, of great work is for me that when you listen to it, take it in. It also teaches you, say, if you're a writer, a great book is one that also teaches you how to write. If you're a singer, great music also teaches you how to be a singer. And there are lines of dialogue in the work, like one that stood out to me this time at the very, to skip to the end, when Lexi sees Peregrine again, the first thing she says out of the forest is, "You did this." And I love that line because it has this double space of this is your fault, but also you accomplished this, you overcame it, and you're occupying that incredible ambiguity space, because the whole piece is asking these questions of when we seek to be able to be self-sufficient, which, if the world is full of the unexplored and who knows what's going to occur, is that kind of egotistical and selfish, or is that rational and smart, right? And it's often in that middle space where it's not clear. In some ways you can see it's good, in other ways you can see it's not good. And that brings me to my first question on Miss Peregrine. For the stories and different things that I do, I always kind of ask questions like, if you were to ask me, why did Dawn do what she did in To Turn the World, or why did Philip do what he did in Blackout? It's always fun because as a writer, you feel like you created them, but then they're also not reducible to your intention, right? They're always something more, even if you don't necessarily, as the creator, have like the crystal ball where you can explain everything, precisely because great writing entails making a character that is not reducible to your intentions, that they're alive. So the first question I have for you, it's when we talk about Peregrine, because the tension in the entire story is he being selfish? Is he doing it for Jacob? He says, I'm doing this for Jacob. Is it kind of selfless because he's working to be able to survive something, so she's not going to put her mother through another death, right? If she's able to self-sustain, then that's a tragedy others won't go through. How do we think of Peregrine's motives? Is he selfish? Is he selfless? What are your thoughts on that, gentlemen?
It's such a good question.
Great prompt.
The first thing that came to mind when you said it was, in our experience of working on the piece, we often framed that self-sufficiency question through the eyes of the parents. We thought a lot about what the job of a parent is. Is it to prepare someone for the world or to protect them from it? And so when I think about it through Peregrine's eyes, it's and her effect on her mother and what she wanted to do for her and for herself. It's such a great question. I think she, at points in the story, lets good intentions build into selfishness. I think about when we're at a midpoint in the story around episode 3, we're seeing where her insistence on doing things her own way, doing them alone, not seeing her friends getting hurt, after John Francis gets injured, and Lexi is clearly expressing that she doesn't really want to go forward with this. We're seeing the height of Peregrine's selfishness around it. But I love that you highlighted that idea that she's looking out for her mother too, because on the parent side, we had Kathy expressing this fear. I just lost one child. I don't want to lose another. And that was her justification for why she was okay with Peregrine doing this dangerous thing in the woods. So I think I was often imagining she was okay with it because she thought this was the way I protect Peregrine from her own sanity, like not even from a safety perspective of that she is actually worried that Peregrine was going to get hurt in the woods, but rather I don't want to lose my child by telling her she can't do what she needs to do to process her grief and can't do what she needs to do just as a growing person. So I think I think mother and daughter were both wrestling with that question. Brett, what comes to mind for you?
It's interesting because I think what I'm left with is I think that it is entirely selfish, but I don't think I think that there's negative and positive versions of selfishness in that regard. I think where it becomes negatively selfish, I think in large part has to do with the fact that she brings her friends into this. I think they are very much outside of her grief. They are outside of her self-preservation. And yet she, certainly, I don't know that she ever really believes that she could do it alone. So I think that there is a sense of like, I need my community. I need my people to come through this rather treacherous journey with me in order for me to fully process my grief. But it is selfish in the same way that growing up is selfish, and I think that was really one of the metaphors that this journey, as Jeff said, is about. How do you prepare your child for the world at large and the chaos of the world outside of the home? And I think we all have that hero's journey within us, which is that rite of passage, that rite of growing up, of coming of age, that you have to do, and it will cost it will cost you the home and the safety and the parentage, but you have to go through that if you're ever going to be a fully sufficient, fully realized adult human being. And that's the moment that Peregrine is in her life. And so she has to go through it. So I don't know that it ever is selfless. I think it is fully selfish, except for maybe there is a space that is around Jacob, that is around the honoring of him, that is around the trying to bring meaning to his life and his death. But again, he's dead. He's gone. Mm-hmm. So I don't know how selfless that ultimately is. So I would argue that it is potentially wholly selfish.
I even want to say, Brett, that hearing you say that it is selfish, but there's good or bad sides to it, makes me think that just the very act of trying to process your grief, you have to do it maybe in a selfish way. But if there's I don't know that it's about selflessness, but the goodness of doing it is that in processing it, you then, and this is a theme we get to near the end of the piece, in some of the final music and just the big picture of it, that if you have processed this grief, you are then in a position to help others process grief in the future.
That's right. And that's where actually Brett's journey comes in. When we look at In a Clearing, that's really his role in that moment, is to say, hey, I'm actually just on the other side of this thing. Finally, let me pull you through.
Yep.
And that is the act of selflessness.
Those are magnificent responses. It makes me think a few things. So one, there's a sense in which if you don't act selfish enough to have the ability to support yourself, that's actually selfless, because then you rely on other people to support you. At the same time, if you are selfish at the expense of other people, then that's kind of a bad selfishness. But it's not always clear what's at the expense of other people. You know, is Peregrine bringing her friends into the forest good for them because they could be in an unexpected situation as well?
Yeah.
Or is it not because he's kind of lassoing them into her grief? The point you made also there, Brett, makes me think, you know, there's always this idea that only you can die your death, like no one can die your death. Well, there's also something about only you can process your grief. Your grief is yours and yours alone. And it kind of makes me think, you know, that famous line in Tolstoy, right? You know, every happy family is the same, but every sad, you know, every miserable family is unique. And it's kind of like people's happiness can be kind of similar. And it's interesting how there's something about grief is it feels like very often it's much more customized, like much more individual. And that's where it creates this kind of alone. You know, now I've got that's the other thing I love about the music. It's in your head and you remember it 2 years later. And it's like you're forced to be alone, even if you don't want to be alone, which then kind of like, it's not like Peregrine asked to be put in that situation, but once she is, it's almost like until you're in a strange woods, until something unexpected occurs, until a brother dies, until something doesn't go right, you don't have to worry about these ambiguity spaces on the line between selfish and selflessness. You know, in regular everyday life, it's much easier to tell the difference between those things. But when you're in a quote unquote strange woods, or when something unexpected occurs, you start to see how these values are not always so easy to define apart. And Peregrine is thrown in a kind of Heideggerian, just thrown into a situation where she has to confront that. And so it brings out this question in very fascinating ways to me.
Yeah, I mean, and it's, I think what you're saying too about the, you know, the when life goes right, as it were, when life sort of progresses in a more or less expected way, it requires less of a person. And it's really when life hits these quite unexpected moments. And the thing is that it will inevitably, we will all, and that's certainly, you know, in the Ballad of the Strange Woods, you know, we say, you know, these are life's inevitabilities that you know, life's unpleasant guarantees that everybody will come to know at some point, and you will be thrust into these strange woods. But it is in that moment that so much is required of you. And it brings to mind, there's a beautiful quote that I love from a play called The History Boys by Alan Bennett, British playwright. And in it, he talks about, you know, the premise of the premise of the play is that it takes place in a sort of a boys' British, you know, boarding school, and they have this beautiful relationship, complicated but beautiful relationship with this English teacher. And he's teaching them all this poetry, and they have to recite this poetry, and they don't quite understand what any of it means. And he says to them, you know, learn it now, understand it later. We're making your deathbeds here, boys, you know, grief, agony. This is what it. And so it's when you're in those moments of extreme life that you suddenly come to mind with, as you said, Tolstoy or these poets or literature or whatever. It sort of allows you to it brings you into a place of processing. Oh, that's what that. Now I understand what, you know, Larkin meant when he wrote, they fuck you up, your mom and dad, or whatever it is. You know what I mean? Like, you have an understanding of it. You're brought into that moment, and there is language given to you in order to help you process it. Because in a way, only poetry, only lyric, only music, only these massive things that deal with theme and language can encapsulate that very human, but very sort of extreme human experience.
It makes me think, just to add to that, you know, on the parent side, so there's this tension of like Peregrine and her mother, but as a parent, I can tell you, it's always interesting with your child, because you know you need to have them bruise their knees, but what kind of parent wants their kid to have their knees bruised, right? So it's this weird thing where you can't will them to hurt themselves. And there's a weird way, though, where you need to put them in a place where they struggle. And yet you're always, as a parent, dealing with the tension of what's too far, what's too little. And in a way, when the bear shows up in that one episode, it's almost like a blessing, because it forces a situation that no parent would wish for a bear to show up and their children confront a bear, right? And yet it's so interesting with life, where you almost need these unexpected events to occur to create a clearing, if you will, an opening, a space in which the children can actually show the parents that actually I'm able to take care of myself, and the parent can then feel relief over, oh, they can take care of themselves, and look at that. And then also be like, they're able to rise to the occasion. Because what's interesting is there's this sense in which modern life, suburbia and all these things, one of the problems is there's not enough opportunities to rise to the occasion, precisely because you're relatively middle class, relatively comfortable. Now, obviously that's not everyone, but that's a dilemma, right? And it makes me think of, there's a great friend of mine, Raymond. He does a lot of work on the topic of what's called thymos, and the classical, so the triadic soul, and like Plato, Socrates, all of them, is notion you have eros, you have logos, but there's also something called thymos. And eros is sexual desire, all of these things. Logos is rational, mental, but thymos is this bravery, courage, rising to the occasion. And for them, if you didn't have all three, you'd be deformed. And actually the other two, eros and logos, without thymos would become tyranny. They could become like tyrannical, actually. Like you see like parents who are helicopter parents, right? They have a lot of desire and love for their children, but it becomes oppressive, right? Or you have intellectuals that have ideas for how everyone should live their life, but they themselves have never, say, worked a blue collar job or been on the ground. So there can be a tyranny in that. So you need all three. And what's so beautiful is, one of the reasons I appreciate it in Strangewood is because it's put its finger on this dilemma that you have today, on this need to kind of feel like you rise to the occasion, and yet the radical complexity and moral difficulty of what exactly that looks like. As a parent, if I know my children need thamos, what am I going to do? Throw them in the middle of the woods and tell them to find their way back? And yet there's a real sense in which you do. And so all of those ambiguities arise.
Yeah, and a thing you brought to mind there that I had not thought about before is that it is in the unexpected moments, both the bear arriving and then also in the blizzard arriving during the final, that we actually see a test of Peregrine. That the thing she tried to construct, just the idea of the final, if there hadn't been that blizzard, I don't know that completing it really even means anything, because it's so contrived. It's the thing she thought would solve the problem. It's not until the blizzard hits, and then Lexi and John Francis and the whole community has to act because something truly unexpected has happened, that they actually can work through the grief. So, and feel like they've processed it and done the thing and shown their bravery, as you're expressing there. Which I hadn't thought about before, but you, like you're saying, even Peregrine, like the parent here in your situation, could not actually create a scenario that would have done the trick.
Just as a quick comment, that I was speaking with Alex Eber at the Net the other day, and we were talking about the difference between a limit and an obstacle. An obstacle is something you construct and you put before yourself, and how because you pick it, it can't have that effect. Where to really change, you have to face a limit, but you can't plan a limit. And so I really like your comment there. Let me give it to Brett.
Two things came to mind for me in both of your comments there, Daniel, is that another thing that, we don't really have in Western culture, and certainly Western modern culture anymore, is, and it's mostly for men, but also for women at this point, are these rites of passages, these rites. We don't have these constructed, which is what you're describing, of these thymos, right? Throwing the kids in the woods, making them undergo some sort of test, the hunt, whatever that, would have been in our, more less Western, culture. And there is something very important lost in that, and you see it in a sort of perpetual, in Peter Panning of culture, the perpetuating of youth, because we don't really have these bridges where we go, no, now you have, faced the world as an adult, and this is what, you are now ready to go through that. At the same time, one of the things that came up for us when we were kind of constructing this piece, and in thinking about why, sort of what is a modern equivalent, why this matters, and we have a very small allusion, or reference rather, to it in the third episode between Eric and Woodsley, where they're saying, the planet's falling apart, kids are getting shot up at schools, and nobody's doing anything about it, right? So maybe they're not really preparing us. And it brings to mind an interview that I just heard recently about, we have all these schools that go through these drills now, right? And there was they were interviewing this group of kids that you know had sort of morbidly thought about what, oh, if I'm in that situation, and they were talking about there was a sort of a relief in the ceiling. Okay, we're going to go up there and that will be our escape route. And then they found themselves in an actual situation. It turned out to be a false call, but they were in lockdown. And when that happened, they did not do what they thought they would so quickly do and rise to this heroic equation or the heroic occasion. They found themselves sort of talking themselves out of doing anything. And it actually would have been, had it been a real situation, probably would have been very dangerous. And so it makes me think about that, where we live in this society where we think we're protecting our kids from everything. We're ultimately not. And even in constructing, Jeff, as you said, this like, well, this is the drill for when this would happen. When the real thing is at the door, we're completely unprepared because it is so chaotic. It is so unexpected. We don't really know how to act in that situation. And there's just a very real and deep and visceral conflict at the heart of that.
It makes me think, so a few things. One, I did wrestling for a number of years, and I was always amazed how during practice it was so easy to do the Granby, and then during the mat, you just couldn't do it. It's just so interesting. And the same when it comes to if you do any sort of investing or anything with money or business, you know what you should do. And then when the time comes, there's that radical differences. A phrase Michelle and I will use is ideas are not experiences, where the experience is like an entirely different universe from the idea. And it makes me also think of a time, we live on a farm, and when I was younger, you would have to separate the mothers from the calves because you'd have to tag them and all that different stuff. And I remember the experience of one time, I'm manning the gate, and usually the cows will run through and you can just close the gate and it's fine. I remember one time though, one of the mothers stopped and looked at me. And it occurred to me that if she charged me, I would be dead because I was behind the fence. There was literally nothing I could do. That my entire life was right there. Because, this is a huge animal. You're done. Yeah. You're done. And luckily, she just walked through the gate. All of those experiences, to me, speak to this really impossibility of ever being fully prepared. And I love how in the show, Hal doesn't make it back, right? Even that given, that reliable, of course, Hal's going to make it back. So much so that they don't even think to ask, where is Hal until days later, right? Even that is destabilized and deconstructed, right? And there's a way in which the show suggests that none of us is ever prepared and can ever be fully prepared, which begs the question, how should we respond to that knowledge and that knowing that you can never be fully prepared? For me, knowing that these things can happen, that's always made it to where you fight boredom, you have gratitude, you see the most in every single day, precisely because something might arise that you don't expect, whether it be an illness or the Peregrine's dad leaves, you have things occur, you think you're making it back, and then he's got hypothermia and you don't know he's going to survive. Something can always change. And so one of the interesting kind of questions is, if life is a strange wood, it would seem to be something about the ability to see beauty in that strange woods, or to see wonder in that strange woods is a proper response. Because I just think of all the situations where the tractor almost flipped, or you almost got hit by something, where something unexpected can occur, and how that leads to a different way of carrying yourself in the world, precisely because there's a vulnerability that you realize is inescapable, that you can't ever overcome it fully.
Yeah, I think if we got close to saying that anywhere, it's in a clearing in the last episode, which is where Brett is trying to help Peregrine and himself process, still trying to articulate that feeling, which we see the clearing as an acknowledgement that we are still in the woods, that you're just in a clearing, you're not out of the woods. That's not ever what we want to suggest. But that you can enjoy the sun in the clearing with friends, with family, knowing that you will go back, and that you can hold both of those things. That's what we are trying to squeeze into that song for sure. So that resonates with me.
And I think the reason that needs to be articulated in that way is because what you're saying, Daniel, I think is the difference between Howland and how he deals with that fact of that you can never be prepared, and where we hope that that Peregrine ends up after this journey. I think that there is the potential of because Howland has the utmost respect for what you can't plan for, but it becomes a sort of removal from it, right? It's a disappearance into the ambiguity as opposed to a thriving within it, right? There is, I think he becomes swallowed by the unknown and by the ambiguity, really. And where we want Peregrine to arrive at the end of the piece is something that is more present in the duality of life, right? And which is what you're saying, that there's both a respect but also a celebration of the fact that I am alive now, and that may not always be the case. Hal is unable to find his way to that celebration of life. I think, you know, his sense of loss is just too great to overcome for him. Yeah.
Oh, well, I find, you see, this question of, for me, vulnerability. Like we always say, like, in order to have relationships, you have to be vulnerable, right? But then in the context of a forest, being vulnerable sounds foolish, right? My gosh, why aren't you more prepared? And what's so interesting is, in order to let other people into your life, you know, let the light in, etc., you have to be open. Well, what else is open? A wound, right? You know, openings also, you have to take your armor off and you can be attacked, right? One of the interesting components that also it makes me think about, bringing up thymos again with Raymond, is in the story of Prometheus with his brother, who's given all the animals, and he gives some claws and he gives some fur, and he gets to human beings and he goes, oh crap, I ran out of stuff. I don't know what to give you guys. And they're like naked and unable to, they don't have fur, they can't survive. And what's interesting is, because then, you know, Prometheus gives them fire. The idea of the story actually is that the reason that humans come to dominate all the other animals is precisely because in their weakness, they're forced to work together, which then makes possible society, politics, and technology. And so they come to rule the planet. And actually what's so interesting about that story is it suggests that it's actually armor that weakens human beings. Because the more armor and less vulnerable you are, the less incentive there is to work together. And when you don't have to work together, well, then you don't have a chance, because compared to like bears and other things, you don't have a chance. So it's precisely the weakness and nakedness of human beings that forces upon them a vulnerability that forces them to then relate. And it's that relationship then that actually makes human beings, you know, take over the earth compared to, say, other animals and different things. And then you see that in the story of In Strange Woods.
Yeah. I mean, I think that was something that was maybe not, I think that was a little bit of a discovery, Jeff, as we got to that final episode, that it really was a societal effort, right? It was about, it wasn't, you know, I think as we constructed this story of, you know, this girl, you know, taking on this journey, you know, there was a sense that somehow they would all survive, they would all sort of come through it, and it would be heroic. And it wasn't until sort of later, moving the pieces around, specifically Lexi and John Francis, that we discovered, oh no, it actually requires the community to come together to work together to, you know, to have this experience. And so that her journey is actually leading the entire community to a sort of a higher point of living. And it really is a, you know, which I think is a more modern and certainly progressive idea, you know, as we deconstruct these heroes' journeys and really sort of start to reject the notion of the one, you know, lone hero. I think that that's present in this piece very strongly in the end.
Yeah, I think so for sure. We just the other day, someone on Twitter was asking us about where in the process did we know that Hal wasn't going to make it out. And we were looking back at some old notes, and we found notes that said, yeah, all 5 kids go into the forest and get separated, and one by one, they each make it back. And then we discover that Hal hasn't made it. And it was funny to see that, because yes, in discovery, in writing, in letting, as you're saying, Daniel, in letting the vulnerabilities and the acknowledgement of the danger by John Francis and Lexi, their intuition there that this is a bad idea, actually is what helped everyone get out alive, or at least all the kids get out alive. And as Brett said, raise the community up through this experience of coming together through it, which is really, if we had, I think, run the test of trying to get each of them out alone, it wouldn't have happened. If we went through and said, how would each of those kids do it? They wouldn't have all made it. Yeah. And so that was interesting to discover along the way.
I think the other thing that is a component in the, what you're saying about, there's a missing point, right? Which is that the human being also has, and this is a very important part of the show, is the emotional response, right? Like, so that there's logic, there is sort of the preparation, but part of what it is not that you can't, what you said, ideas are not experiences, right? And the reason that is because when you're having the idea of it, it's very intellectualized. When you're in the experience, there's an emotional component, right? And so, and that was, early on, we knew that it was going to be about, people making critical decisions or emotional decisions in critical situations, right? And it's like, and that is a variable that you almost, I think if anything, that's the thing that Hal has almost tamed, right? Is his emotional response, that he can stay cold-blooded in these situations, that he has gotten to a place where he's almost locked emotion in a box, and that his interaction with Peregrine, his sort of reemerging into society, reawakens that emotion. And perhaps, I mean, I am very reluctant to say what happens to him in the woods and what is the end of the story. But if he doesn't make it back, it is perhaps because of that, because he has found some way back to emotional completion. I mean, what the message that he leaves her, right, is on the back of that picture with Gerda, and the part in the picture of, Gerda is gone. So that it does somehow suggest that he has found a way back to an emotional life through his interaction with Peregrine, and understanding that you can't change
what happened.
Change what happened. Thank you. Yeah. Couldn't find the language.
What happened. Yeah. Yes. And as you're saying that, Brett, and I know, Daniel, you've always been generous about the song, Something So Pure, that is him expressing his fight, his battle against how do I live in a world the way Gerda does, where she is actually seeing and experiencing the terrible things of it and feeling them, and as opposed to just sitting in the dark later and shutting them out. And yeah, I'm just reminded of both of those themes.
Yeah.
Well, there's a few that. So first off, one of the not to beg to know what happens, because I don't want to know what happens, because that's the fun. Because in life, part of the reasons life is alive is because you don't always know what's going on. That's why you have a mystery that's always captivating. But one of the things I find so funny, like so genius in the writing, frankly, to compliment you, is so we have Hal, and Brett's coming back, and he's like, we just found out that Hal may have just stood back and let the barrels go off and kill everyone. And then he runs off to the war, right? Sandra's like, well, he just left us with the pieces, right? Well, maybe that's what happened at the end. Maybe he knew that they were going to find out that he knew about Jacob and let him die or something. He just left. But it's funny how you as the viewer just kind of forget about it. You're like, oh, he died, so he must be innocent. But you actually don't know that for sure. That thread is left open, right? Yeah. And so it actually shows you're actually participating in the story that Sandra put forth in their family as the viewer formally in the structure. So I really found that very well done. The other thing I want to say about Gerda that I really appreciate is, for me, the camera is a fascinating question. Because if I take a picture of something, am I making an abstraction that kind of disconnects me from it because I'm taking a picture of war? Or is that a freezing it to force you to look at it and face it? Or is it a turning something violent into beauty, which is good? Or is it grotesque? Right? Is it kind of wrong to do that? And the camera, as having such a prominent role, the picture really brings all those questions up, right? And it's also a question for the artist. If you're making a story about a murder or a death or a suffering family or like all of these different things, are you using something in a bad way? Or is that precisely what needs to occur to take the shards of life and create with it? And if we don't do that as human beings, we lose our minds, frankly. Like if Peregrine, I almost said Penelope, and the reason is because actually when I see Peregrine, I think of Homer staying at Ithaca, and the flip is that this Penelope leaves because Ulysses doesn't come back or dies. So those, I've kind of put those in my head together. Anyway, but it's like she's, you know, she has to respond to the fact that her brother dies in this just crazy random accident. And for her, she processes it through learning survival skills. Well, likewise, art is often this is a world where crazy stuff happens, or it's ambiguous and it's confusing and we don't know what to do. So we have to create with it to process it. But you see, one of the problems though is a lot of art, this is another reason I compliment In Strange Woods so much, is a lot of art can process it in a simplistic, non-ambiguous, this is the way, you know, this is the way, which isn't real, which isn't real to life. And actually just a proper framing of the ambiguity is extremely useful, because very often as human beings, we sense, intuit, or know something that we don't understand or is not presented to us in a manner that we can emotionally connect with to it and then think it through better so that we can have a better dead reckoning to work with the woods, because we know the human experience we've gone through. So we have a sense of where to go. And so In Strange Woods accomplishes that so well. But the question of the photograph and Gerda, like, don't move, and like don't move, it's like, is that saying I don't want any more suffering to occur, so don't leave, you know, stay in your room, you know, Peregrine, you're the mom, don't move, stay in your room, don't get hurt? Or is it a putting there where you're facing the world, you're escaping the world, the photograph symbol brings that all to mind? And I think that's a fascinating question one has to face.
Well, I think what's interesting about that is, you know, I don't know that I don't know that we had enough of the understanding of Gerda within that, you know, certainly not in the piece. But what I do think that you bring up with that metaphor is actually very apt for is the entire structure of the podcast itself. Because part of what we were playing with, and I think part of what our draw for a certain kind of audience was a sort of like, hey, you understand this form, which is a very sort of fixed form. There is a mystery that we will solve at the end of it, and you will feel very satisfied. And as we go through the story, we really start to tear that apart for the listener, hopefully in a satisfying way that, you know, we attract them in with something that they think is very familiar and fixed. And then at the end of it, they go, oh, this is, you know, there is no, you know, satisfying answer. You know, Jacob's death was an accident. There is no mystery of, it's not a whodunit, and we don't know what happened to Howell at the end. And, you know, and so there is a lot of this ambiguity that arises, but from a story standpoint, I think the themes and the journey that Peregrine goes on is the thing that allows us to sort of feel some sort of catharsis and satisfaction on the other side. But that idea of a fixed form of art trying to encapsulate something that is very messy and put it in a box is, I think, what a lot of true crime podcasts does to a certain effect for their audience. And we were playing with that as a means of saying, you know, come here, this is something you're very familiar with, and then saying, actually, it's completely different than what you're expecting.
Yeah, we were definitely super conscious of, as you were getting at too, of the risks around taking a photo of war and turning it into beauty. Is that grotesque in some way? Our equivalent here is, how is just the true crime form in and of itself an exploitation of someone's like worst thing that has ever happened in their lives or their family's life? So we were engaging with that a lot. And it makes me think as well about, as Brett was saying, it's not, let me say that one of the inspirations, obviously, for the piece was both Serial and S-Town. So with Serial, one of the jokes we always had, or I always used to say, was that it felt like it was a love story. It was about Sarah Koenig falling in love with Adnan. And, you know, it's a joke, but not really. Like, I remember the moment in serial where she receives maybe a call or a letter from him where he's like, I don't really know you. Like, we've talked a few times on the phone, and Sarah Koenig is like just shaken to her core by this. And so, and similarly with S-Town, where it is such a character study, where Brett was the one who brought up, like, it, and upon first listening to it, feels like, could this guy even be real, this character? You know, it's those two things that played a role in our structuring of this and initial impetus for exploring it. And I think even in the time since then, and it's not to say that true crime books didn't always exist. My father's actually a huge fan of them and has read them forever, and has always been consuming them. But, you know, the popularity and the mainstream level of true crime, you know, from that until Dahmer today on Netflix, has just, you know, blown up. And there's like smug content around it, like very like tongue-in-cheeky content about murders that has always, I think, been really shocking to us. And so we wanted to engage with that. And because it's a fiction, because we have the power to be able to say, no, you don't get to, we're not going to give you this satisfying, aha, it was a murder and this teenager got killed and you got to have a great time following us on this fun journey for it. I think that was powerful and cathartic for us as consumers who are being inundated with that sort of content, to be able to create something that undercuts it.
Yeah.
Well, you know, as we come on the last 10 minutes, first, I've loved every minute of this and would love to speak with you for about 9 hours. And again, I just cannot compliment you enough on this work. One of the things that I really thought about a lot as I went through In Strange Woods again this year is comparing Brett Ryback, which this is for me the brilliance, one of the most brilliant moves of the work, is comparing Brett Ryback with the company Helium, right? That makes the missiles for the war, okay, and all the fuels. So they're like, you know, Sandra's adamant. He's like, the company, no, we didn't support war. We didn't support murder. We just created missiles. And there's this kind of distancing, right, between the company and war. You know, they really kind of disconnect. They're profiting from it. They're making a lot of money, but we don't support war. No, we just defend the country, right? Yeah. So likewise, there's this kind of idea of, oh, I don't like watching murder. I don't like murder. I'm just watching Serial, right? There's this kind of distancing effect. Where what we see in Brett Ryback is, as the story goes along, he is making the choice to be deeper. The narrator is deeper involved in the story. And to me, this is actually, in some respects, one of the main points of In Strange Woods, because and this is why I think it's actually very important that you don't know what happens to Hal and you have an ambiguous mark. Because when you don't know what happens to Hal and you have an ambiguity on did Penelope, I'm saying Penelope now, wow, did Peregrine make a great choice? You don't get those answers. So you have to focus on something else as being the central motor of the work. And for me, that comes into the choice of Brett as a narrator to be involved in these people's lives, as opposed to not being involved in their story. So instead of being like Helium, that's like, we're just kind of we're not doing anything. Instead of like watching Serial and enjoying, all this snuff crap, there's this idea of, no, these are human beings and I am part of the story. And you could come up with all these ethical questions of, should a narrator get involved? Shouldn't they get involved? But I think it's so important, especially in modern life today, where you have so many screens, you have so many bad things happening, you have so much that you're consuming, that it's really important to make that choice like Brett does, to become part of the story, to go on the search team to find Peregrine. And of course, there's the ambiguous note of, is he doing it just for the to record the show? Yeah. But this is where I think it's really well done. And someone else made this point that I mentioned in the document, is that, as the story goes along, Brett sings more, right? His involvement correlates with the amount he sings. Well, the singing, Brett, if it was just a show, you would not expect Brett to be singing like he is. Like you see the emotion coming through, where it's breaking through the sense that this is just a podcast. Now Brett really connects with his people. And this is where, for me, in order for that that meaning of In Strange Woods to come through, it must be a musical, actually. It must have a musical component, because that is a certain expression that has the possibility of breaking through the feeling of potential artificiality of the podcast, because now we're singing. Now now Brett is literally singing in a clearing. And so it signals that he is actually involved. And it, to me, speaks to how it's so important today to relate to the things that we're watching or consuming, or the people around them, that they motivate song out of us, per se, that they motivate music out of us. And for me, the character of Brett embodies that very well.
Yeah. One of the things that is so interesting is that, part of why Brett is so invested, the mystery you asked about, you sort of brought up the motor of the piece. And for us, the motor of the piece was, we kept coming back to, the character is the mystery, right? That Howl, the idea of Howl, the question of Howl is the mystery. And it's really Brett is the one who keeps, changing the angle on him, and hopefully through Brett, the audience as well. And the reason that is so, the reason that Brett is so invested in Howl, which is not clear until the very end, is that he's actually invested in Gerda, and that connection is what drives his intense scrutiny of this human being. And it's kind of that the rest of it kind of happens around that search, and he is pulled in because there is a real human element. And so it is something that is very sort of like, I'm trying to look over here. And I think it's one of the great, to be perfectly honest with you, I'm very proud of the sort of sleight of hand of that, because we keep looking at Howl, and he's sort of just always off screen, even as, our protagonist, Peregrine, is kind of moving us through a more traditional plot, but we're always sort of trying to get a point of view on Howland. And it's not until the very end that there is a very clear reason as to why that is, which is, vis-a-vis Gerda. And the other thing that swam around in my mind just recently in thinking about this conversation, is that I think part of the thing that makes Howl and makes the exploration of Howl unusual, and I'd love to hear your point of view on this, Daniel, given your your knowledge of literature canon, is that Howl is really in the hero's journey. He's a guide figure, and I was trying to think that there aren't really works that explore the guide figure with such intense scrutiny. Oftentimes, they are these mysteries that we don't ever really get to look at. I was thinking about, Virgil in Dante's, we don't really know about him. He's just sort of the guy that takes us through to Purgatorio and then says, ciao. Obi-Wan Kenobi, in the first Star Wars, and now, of course, there's a whole, backstory given to him. But like, up until that point, he is this mystery. We don't know a lot about his inner workings. Gandalf is a similar sort of figure where he is a mystery. Dumbledore has probably the most, backstory given right before his death. We sort of learn a lot more about his connection to the greater story. But even that he is a mystery for so long. And there's something so compelling about these mysterious guide figures. And I feel like our story, and certainly from Brett's perspective, is trying to train the camera as much as we can on this person that kind of historically seems to be unknown.
And resistant. And resistant to being known. I feel like we knew that throughout the whole process. We kept being like, well, we want to see more of Howl. We want him to sing more. But if you do the math on number of lines that Howl has in this show, like when we recorded with the wonderful Patrick Page, like we got his dialogue done so quickly, in part because obviously he's an excellent actor and was prepared and nailed it, but also because there's very little that he actually says, which is a powerful tool, but funny to encounter when you're working on it. And to know he has this impact on the audience, despite saying very little, but yeah, wanting to know more from him. So yeah, Daniel, I'd be curious if anything comes to mind for you around that.
I'm glad this came up, because something else that stood out to me upon this revisit is the fact that, correct me if I'm incorrect, I don't think we get any new dialogue from Howl after episode 2. I think after episode 2, that's it. It's just repeat. And what's so funny is, to me, that's a testament to the success of how he consumes the story, he covers everything, and yet is nowhere. Because you literally go, wait a minute, there's no new dialogue from Hal until after episode 2. That's crazy, because he's everywhere and yet nowhere at the same time. So that's a testament. The other thing I was going to say is another reason why In Strange Woods passes very well the test of rereading is precisely because the mystery. So the first time you're compelled by that mystery, where you want to know who How is, you go through. Yes. The second time you get this layer of the choice, like you start going into the meaning because you know what the mystery is, right? So you have the engine of the mystery for How, and then what I'm describing as the reader, this engine of the kind of choice that it brings. Am I going to be more involved in people's lives? And a story can only pass the reread test, as I'm putting it, if it has those it doesn't have the plot can't be the only mystery and choice, right? There has to be a meaning, like a meta layer, a higher level. And that choice that Brett makes in the story, to me, is a big deal. To this question of the guide, I think as Western thought has become more of a rugged individual, the guide figure has fallen off, because you want to have the hero figure it all out for themselves. If something guides them, it's like the parents die in the Disney movie, it's a disaster or a monster. Right? There's like a monster that forces action, but the notion of someone being lost and then turning to someone to guide them, like an elder, that has gone out the window as the demographic structure has transformed. As you've lost apprenticeship, as you've lost mentorship, really starting with the 1950s, the story structure changes dramatically from that point. Before that, you will have characters who are children encountering older people who will guide them, rather it be in a Dickens. You have a community that is developing the character along. Now it's the hero is a much more rugged individualism. And what you do seem to have today is a kind of a questioning of that. People are talking today that now it's meta-modernity. It's not post-modernity, it's meta-modernity. Now I'd have to go into what that means, but there's more of it. What does it mean? I didn't even know we had defined post-modernity. I guess we're on meta-modernity now. And there's now this kind of sense of the community has a role. But sometimes it seems as if there's a struggle for people to figure out where they need to go to fill that role. Like, where are the resources to even sort of explain that? Because encountering those resources would force you to confront an ambiguity that a lot of the logocentric modernist thinking is just problem solution. So we don't have a lot of that William Epson sort of ambiguity in our thinking. But I'm hoping, but works like In Strange Woods brings to the forefront why we need to reconsider that.
Yeah, Brett's always been someone who's championed bringing in more cross-generational relationships into pieces. The next piece we're working on encounters that a lot too, but I think you're right. It's lacking.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Brett. Yeah.
And it's interesting though that this piece also does that thing about examining what is the role of the society, and and it really sort of, while it redeems society at the end, it really, what's the word? Makes culpable society at the beginning,
right.
Yeah.
Yes, it definitely puts the community on trial. Have they failed? They're young. Yeah. And we still are asking that question. Like, I think to your point about ambiguity, the community comes together to solve a clear problem in the end, because the problem is clear in some ways. It is a thing. Those people went out, they did this, we can go save them. But there are still floating questions that we don't know. Would this community come together in more abstract ways as we think about the environment, as we think about gun violence, as we think about things that are harder to say, there's the problem, let's go fix it? I don't know. I don't know if they would.
I love that question. And I know we're coming up on the end here, and gentlemen, I really appreciate this. That question of, are we still as human beings only able to come together when there's a clear problem? Or can we have that occur and then learn from that to come together when we're just going through our daily life and visiting the grocery store? I think that is the next level that's so important, because it's one thing to become a community, to fight a common enemy or to solve a common problem, but it's an entirely another thing to engage in the dynamics of which are more subtle, more discreet, and not so clear. And actually, when it comes to problems like gun violence, global warming, warming, I think you have to be able to do that, because the problem, it is not clear, for example, how you stop global warming. It seems clear, but it is not. It's a much more complex problem. And if you can't operate on that level, then you're going to be in trouble. I think that's really well put. And I agree with the cross-generational. So gentlemen, the last question I wanted to ask you as we come to the end, and I really appreciate your time, is 2 years later, after In Strange Woods, what are your thoughts about it? How do you relate to it now? What are some, like you were mentioning some ideas. I just love how you talk about it as alive and you're still thinking about these questions. I think that right there is testament of its greatness. When the creators themselves feel it of it alive, and over the years it unveils itself more to them, it asks more questions. That shows that the art is living and breathing. And I certainly feel that way about it. And I've enjoyed this chance to speak about it. So just in closing, how do you relate to it now, 2 years later? What thoughts come to mind?
I'll hop in. I'll say that Brett and I are working through what this show with the series could look like as a television show. So we are actively re-examining motivation of characters, seeing how having a literal camera changes how we especially think about the character of Brett. Actually, if he is on camera, what more do we need? Does it kind of necessitate that we know about him, and that do we end up seeing? So that stuff is in the air. But I'll just say this, because when you asked that, the first thing that came to mind to me, because we were wrestling with it while we were working on it, but it felt enough on the bubble, is that right now, in everything that has happened in the time since we wrote it into today, I don't know that it quite makes, I don't know that it doesn't make sense. It does make sense without this context, but the political element and literal national politics, it seems hard. It would seem hard to me today if we set out to put a piece in the Northwoods of Minnesota and not engage with the political element, especially generationally. Some of the characters who have, different identity, perceptions of themselves and each other and their belief system, and engaging with faith and engaging with a lot of topics that I think, I won't say we avoided, but it didn't feel like we had to engage with them in the context of the piece when we did it now. And when we did it then, and now I wonder, would we have had to more tangibly? I don't know. It's on my mind.
When I think about it 2 years out, and I think this sort of surprised me, when we were creating it, we were very much trying to make it feel, very alive, very real. The fact that I use my actual name in the piece to try to blend this, version of reality. And what remains for me that is a little unexpected is that it really does feel like a little bit of not a fantasy land, but a place, a magical place that exists somewhere tucked up in this, space that is, sort of like Stephen King's version of Maine, right? It's like it is on the map somewhere, but it doesn't exist in this dimension. And it is, and when I really think about, and I, encounter on social media, people experiencing it for the first time, and what I always want people, sort of the way that I want them to experience it, is to sort of go, somewhere snowy, go somewhere cold, take a long walk, and disappear into this magical place for a little bit. And that's kind of where it lives for me. And when I do step back into it, I am transported, in a way that feels like it lives in a location somewhere on a map that is distant from where I am now, despite having, helped invent it.
Yep.
Beautiful answers, gentlemen. One of the reasons I like In Strange Woods so much is because when I think of it, even in just being such a well-told story and well-designed, that it applies to today and it applies to my thinking and provides a kind of dead reckoning. Something I watched 2 years ago actually helps me navigate the world today. I think that's a beautiful testament to it. The last thing I'll say is that, Harold Bloom once said about the characters of Shakespeare is that they have more flesh and more blood and they're more human than us. That they're actually more human than we are. And one of the beautiful parts, another testament to In Strange Woods, is that it's always shocking to me when I remember that Peregrine is actually fictional, that How is fictional, where I find it more of a scandal that they don't walk down the street with me, because you gentlemen and Matt and the entire team did such a remarkable job of creating a world that feels indeed like I could get in my car and drive to it. And in meeting those people, my life is deeper for it. And so thank you for creating something that makes the world less of a strange woods and more of an exciting place the way that it is, because you did such a wonderful job to illuminate it in your work. So thank you, gentlemen. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Daniel. Thanks so much.
All the best.